Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to this special transmission on the US presidential elections. The whole thing is very interesting if we look at the situation inside the United States and also about United States foreign policy. Of course, there are many things that we'll discuss in today's special transmission on US elections. First of all, the internal situation, political situation in the United States. There are internal divisions and schisms that we see at the moment. The role that racism has played in the United States, in US politics for that matter, Black Lives Matter, people of color, and their approach towards these elections, and the way President Trump has been approaching these groups inside the United States. Also, this race between Democrats and Republicans, that is one thing. But other than that, President Trump has his own way of dealing with the political issues, let it be COVID-19, let it be, as I mentioned earlier, the Black Lives Matter, or several other things we'll be discussing in today's program. Other than that, other than these political schisms, what we see is that we see a lot of wooden placards, plywood, wooden floors that we see were used in these elections. A rise of militia, white supremacists in several parts of the United States. That is also one of the biggest concerns for a lot of people inside the United States, and we are still waiting for the results. We'll be discussing about that. But what is more important is the US foreign policy after these elections, after the results come in. President Joe Biden, the former Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden, his approach towards foreign policy, US foreign policy, Trump's foreign policy, and these elections are very important for South Asia as well as for Middle East. President Trump has been very experimental with his diplomacy in South Asia as well as Middle East. Let it be Israel-UAE relations, Palestine, let it be North Korea, Iran or China. All these areas are something that President Trump has experimented with. We'll be discussing about that as well. We have in the studios Mr. Salman Zaidi, Director, Jinnah Institute, Public Policy Think Tank based in Islamabad. Welcome to the show, Salman. Second guest is Dr. Amna Mahmood. She is renowned senior academic and expert on international relations and Pakistan's foreign policy. Welcome to the show, Dr. Amna. Right, and we have Amina Ali, a Democrat. Amina Ali, a Democrat leader from Washington. She has just joined us. Welcome to the show, Amina. Salman, talking about these elections, first of all, how do you see the internal political dynamics, these schisms and divisions that I just talked about, Black Lives Matter, the people of color and white supremacists and all that. President Trump's approach to these issues, how do you see that?
Taimur, as we speak, the situation has gotten more complicated because just about 2 hours ago, President Trump went online and there was a tirade by him saying that there's a fraudulent vote, etc., which of course left many dumbfounded. And there was a reversal by the Republican Party and commentary. A lot of commentary has already happened on the cynicism that this vote brings. We have been looking at it since last night, and of course the many movements that you mentioned, including Black Lives Matter, etc., speak to the great cacophonous democracy that the US is and perhaps will not be. We are looking at this election with interest because we are also looking at a referendum of democracy in a country that has had a long established history, that has been at times claimed to be the leader of the free world. If that leadership does not remain and it is contested, not in foreign policy terms, but in terms of leading the way for democratic governance of human rights, then this will be a telling moment for the US as well as the rest of the world. We are looking at this election also to see the future of many countries, many communities that are connected via diasporas, and Pakistan in particular, where about 500,000 strong community in the US sends remittances, etc., is very clued into its own benefit, and there is a divided vote. There are Pakistani Muslims, there are Muslims across the US who have voted Republican. So it undoes the myth that a democratic win will really be the greater good for Muslims in the US.
Right.
Internally there are schisms, as you said, But externally, I think there is less reason for hope, and we can talk about, you know, all the externalities that come with this election. Whether it is a Biden win or a Trump win, I think foreign policy stays much the same, other than a few issue areas, and we can talk about that.
But this is very interesting, the foreign policy specifically, Trump's foreign policy and Biden's foreign policy. But before that, Dr. Amna, talking about these internal political dynamics, the way a lot of people in the United States at the moment, they feel insecure, militias in the United States for that matter, in Michigan for that matter. How do you see the security situation first of all, and the insecurities of a lot of people who are taking part in these elections? How do you see that?
Yes, Taimur, there is a lot of change, as just my panelist pointed out. American society is passing through a transition, and that was visible at the time of the elections of Donald Trump. You know, incidentally, when the previous election held, I was there in the United States. And I was landed in Washington the day he took oath as you know, he inaugurated in White House, and there was so, you know, uncertainty in American society with the win of this Donald Trump, and war of words between two parties, between two competitors, Hillary Clinton and Mr. Trump, and uncertainty was there, and you see that there was a period of threat, violence against different communities, you know, marginalized communities, and most Muslims were not only the target, but colored Americans, including blacks and others, were the target. So a scenario would be it would not be very different if Mr. Donald Trump would continue in office. But if you see Biden, circumstances are, you know, her soulmate running for vice president, she is an Indian, and she is having the support of all Indian community, and I think that this time anti-ethnic vote, anti-ethnic US policy vote would be against Donald Trump, and that is not necessarily in favor of Muslims. So we should not be very optimistic if Mr. Joe Biden would be there. And as we are talking about that, foreign policy would be less or more the same, because you see that Democrat and Republican are having almost diverse policy as far as domestic policy is concerned. They are having different agenda, talking about if in favor of Republican are conservative, so they are talking about no abortion right and religious conservatism.
This is interesting, since you both are talking about the foreign policy. Many people think, Salman, that if you look at Trump's foreign policy, he has taken some decisions that were perhaps not very popular with the military establishment back in the United States, in DC for that matter. I mean, from Syria to Afghanistan, pulling out troops from these two countries was not an easy deal. Probably Obama administration couldn't do it, but Trump actually did that, you know, because he promised in his previous election campaign that he would pull out troops from Syria and Afghanistan, and he did it. General James Mattis wasn't happy with this decision. So probably Trump is a doer. He is a go-getter, and he actually can deliver things. That is what the impression is back in the United States. And in terms of foreign policy, do you agree with that?
Well, certainly, if you ask the constituencies that support him across the Bible Belt, they also see him as a messianic character who will deliver them. But you know, outside the US, it's not so much the foreign policy action that he has taken, but the kind of erratic personality he brings to this. You know, any capital of influence where that is a participant in conflict theaters across the world, there is reduced bandwidth for adventure, for having active tweet handles that sort of undercut your partners, etc. Now, Mr. Trump did all of that, and his allies have been alienated over the last 4 years. Many of his partnerships have not come through. Some of them have actually come through in a very big way, particularly the ones in the Middle East. But part of that has to do with Mr. Trump's very transactional, very, as you say, go-getter kind of deal making. He is a man who is interested in deals. He is a man who sees instant benefit in creating profit for himself or the Republican Party. I'm not so sure he even identifies as a Republican,
right,
or even as or reflects their core values. The manifesto that you referred to was written by sane, cool heads from the army that of litigators that the Republican Party is puts together. But Mr. Trump is really his own man, and the degree of erratic action that we have seen White House, 2 a.m. tweets or 4 p.m. cancellations, will continue into his next presidency. Now that does create a degree of uncertainty in foreign policy, but Trump is the devil we know. And we also know that there are things that we can work with. We can actually depend on his disastrous sort of anti-Iran tirade. We can depend on his Middle Eastern
specifically Palestine for that matter,
Palestine, the way it's gone. We can depend on actually bet on closer coordination between Israel and the US. We can actually bet on greater antagonism within the US against Muslims.
But this is very interesting, and we'll also talk about the Democrat foreign policy of Obama administration. That too wasn't probably that different from Trump administration's foreign policy in terms of, let's say, South Asia, or at least for Pakistan and Afghanistan. We'll be discussing about that. But before that, we are joined by Ms. Anila from California. She's campaigner for Joe Biden and a Democrat leader. Welcome to the show, Ms. Anila. Talking about the situation, political situation in the United States. How do you see this? The votes are coming in. How do you see the political temperature at the moment in the United States and specifically in California?
Well, it's night, but I don't think people are getting a lot of rest. There's a lot of anxiety. Should we stock up on food? There's news of the militia on the left. There's news of the militia on the right. There have been attacks on African Americans, and people are just basically anxious. I mean, can you blame them when the president comes at 2 a.m. in the middle of an election and he says, well, we did win this election, and he completely disenfranchises the millions of voters who sent their ballots by mail. He had also attacked the USPS, and it slowed down. They admitted to being slow. And this is seen as an attack on democracy. People are afraid right now. They're anxious. But at the same time, as a Democrat, I feel that some of the results are, I'm really glad that talking to Democrats, analysts, that we did not totally rely on the pollsters. They've gone back and checked why they were wrong again. 2016 can happen again. And so we are cautiously optimistic. We can't really declare who's a winner yet. We have to count millions of ballots. So let's hold on. And the thing is, like, even Twitter tagged President Trump's tweet as misleading, creating this, disenfranchisement and this anxiety. It's disconcerting for the people who believe in America being the bastion of civil rights, liberty, and democracy. If we're going to call international observers to come and see and oversee our democratic election process, then you know what? There will be no democracy in the world. So I think all of these things have really brought out for Democrats, like, why isn't our message resonating with the white suburban woman, with the white male in Pennsylvania, with a lot of African Americans? President Trump has seemingly done well with the African American men, the Latino vote, the Cubans. And so why isn't the democratic messaging getting there? What can we do to change that? I also feel the demographics have changed. Arizona, it's got a lot of young Latinos, and they're growing up embracing the actual democratic values of inclusion, diversity, and equality. So, that's the silver lining that I'm seeing. But yes, we are still optimistic, but we think that, this is an attack on the democratic institutions that we hold so dear as Americans.
Right, and Anila, how do you see the situation, the security situation in United States? Many newspapers from Europe and United States have been reporting that the media people, the reporters have been wearing the bulletproof jackets, and this is the kind of election that is going on in United States. Plywood boards are used by many shops. How is the security situation in several parts of United States? Not California, I'm sure, but elsewhere.
Look, I'll are all registered in California. So there are hardcore white supremacists, neoconservatives who think
I think there, right. There is some technical issue. We'll get back to Anila. But Dr. Amna, right. I'll go to Dr. Amna and talking about the security situation that I raised up this point again. The militia, the rise of militia is alarming, although this is not the first time that this is happening in the United States, I'm sure. This has been there in the past as well. But specifically, I remember last month, FBI arrested almost 10 people involved in some kind of in a position, in a process to abduct and kidnap the governor of Michigan. And I also remember that President Trump tweeted, "Free Michigan," you know. So this is the kind of politics that is going on in the United States at the moment. How do you see these trends? I won't say they are new, but they have emerged again. How do you see that?
Rising trend. We can say that these are the rising trends, especially in the wake of more dissatisfaction against the democratic norms which have been implemented and practices through the period of this Donald Trump. And as Salman pointed out, that you cannot, you see that Trump behaved like a devil at international level, but same happened in United States as well. You see that that was actually police action against the innocent people on the roads. He said they should mend their ways. And United States is getting one of the largest countries spending more on policing rather than on the welfare. And there are suggestions raising, people are raising these voices even within the Congress, that there should be more money allocation for welfare of the people, so that they should be law abiding, because they are protesting for the rights and they are protesting for the jobs, for equal rights, for rights given under the First Amendment, Second Amendment, right of freedom of expression, and that when it would be denied, certainly police would be there, and when it would be challenged, there would be violence. And elections are obviously a little violent, especially in the states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Florida, larger states having larger vote for electoral college. And if you remember that during the period of second Bush, Florida was the most controversial state. There are 23 votes of electoral college, and that there was recounting. So, right. And there are and these states are fluctuating states. Their result may change the whole scenario. That's why violence is there, and United States and government is not able to handle that. One reason that Mr. Trump is losing its grip on its losing a writ of the government at several areas. One, but violence is actually a state matter, because implementation of law in making
law and order, right?
Yeah, that is the matter of state. And those states having diversity in ethnicity, they are more volatile. And again, due to the policy of the federal government, that they are not implementing actually the first 10 amendments of US Constitution.
So, Salman, is this about the new trends that we see within the United States? Is it about the new emerging identities, or is it about the way people want to see them being represented, by the presidents? And probably the Democrats have not been able to work on it, and Republicans are working on it, and Trump administration specifically is using that element of identity. How do you see this?
There has always been a large democratic deficit in the way governments represent their constituencies. There is a large gap, and this is an argument that goes back to the 70s, where democratic deficits were discovered across democracies that are doing well. it is quite noteworthy that the US, this election, is pointing to all the metrics that you have for fragile democracies, where you see violence on the day of the election, where you see troops being called in, where there's a possibility that the Supreme Court is invoked for an extended period of time, where the candidates who are contesting the election don't go out without a fight. There is more violence that follows. These are all metrics for by the internationally accepted standards, which the US and its organizations have been part of creating. Now we see all of that unfolding on the streets of these swing states or other places. Having said this, I think there is no turning away from the many contested realities that are part of the US today, and which have received a kind of urgency with this presidency. Mr. Trump has antagonized many communities. He has galvanized his right-wing core, and of course, there's people like the QAnon. There's of that right-wing group, cult group, whose representative has just won. So the representation of these people of extreme right-wing groups in the parliament, in Congress, is also of something that we have seen in our democracies. Imperfect, fragile, whatever they are, the US is looking increasingly like us, because the US is a microcosm of the international community. Whether or not these communities find representation or not, I don't think the clamor will go away with this election. Now, looking beyond the election immediately, I think there are the questions, the unanswered questions around race, ethnicity, the violence, the Black Lives Matter. None of that is going away. But I'm also struck by something that Anila Ali said. She said that should this not happen, then democracy in the world will end. I'm quite if constituents in the US perceive them as citizens of a world or a country that is leading democracy, I think this is a moment that instructs them as well. I think the rest of the world fully appreciates that the US is not a capital on the hill. The US is not the shining paragon of democracy. The US is not an upholder of human rights. It is never seen in that light. It is seen as an aggressor. And the cynical commentary that's coming out from the rest of the world as we watch this election is points to the fact that the US, you may have a Trump, may have many Trumps, but you do not have his antithesis coming out from the US.
This is very interesting, Anila. Trump's antithesis coming from the United States, how do you see that? Right, you heard Salman. What is your take on this?
First of all, I think America is the greatest country to be a Muslim and to live there, because the Constitution totally protects us. Secondly, I also feel that what has happened in America is what I call the Corbynization of the Democratic Party. That's also played into what we see happening today. Let's also review, how did Mr. Trump come to power? He came to power by leveraging the negativity that had grown in Americans from the 20 years of foreign policy, interventions in wars in different countries, and he used it for his political expediency. That is populism. That is how he came to power. So the sentiments that you see, the fear of the other person, not liking the immigrant, he used it to his best advantage. That doesn't mean that all of us are branded or are affected. Pakistanis are doing really well in America. Majority of us enjoy the prosperity. We are there for different reasons. We also vote differently. We are not a monolithic group. We think and we join the Democratic Party. We are no party preference people as well. I've spoken to a lot of Pakistanis who said, look, I'm not voting at the top of the ballot, but down the ballot, I'm voting blue. And then there are people who have joined the Republican Party. That tells you that democracy is still there, that we care about our values. In fact, if you recall, when Vice President Joe Biden was nominated and when he was endorsed by the Democratic Party as our candidate, the first thing we talked to him about was Kashmir. And yes, we haven't had a perfect foreign policy, but we're learning. We're also engaging more with the diaspora, with Pakistanis, with Indians. Now, I want to tell you that the Indians and the Pakistanis, from the numbers that I've got, they've voted for Joe Biden. They've voted for the Democrats. Yes, and they have also voted for President Trump. But generally, I don't see that we want to bring back the leadership that we had in the world. But yes, obviously, 20 years of foreign policy has left dents in our relationships with Pakistan.
There's another prevailing sentiment in the region, I would say, in Middle East and South Asia, that if we compare the Democrat foreign policy and Republican foreign policy, we see a lot of difference. And the difference is, we saw the number of drone strikes by the Obama administration in Pakistan and Afghanistan. We saw wars from Syria to Afghanistan. But a lot of people in South Asia, and specifically in Pakistan, they're of the view that at least Trump is trying to wind up wars from Syria and Afghanistan, pulling out troops and probably now focusing more on China. But for the people of these countries, it is better that we have less wars in South Asia and in Middle East. So this is primarily the main difference of foreign policy, Trump's foreign policy and Obama's foreign policy, Democrat and Republican. How do you see that?
He called for war, he threatened war with Korea. As soon as he came, he plays his brand. He's a showman, and he wanted to be macho and do what his base wants him to do. That's, threaten people. And I think that what you're going to see, if we get Mr. Trump back, you're going to see an America that is even more isolated than it was 4 years ago. You're going to see an America that is leaning more towards non-interference in foreign affairs. You're going to see already the State Department is 1/3 the size it was. A lot of the people that were aware of the relationship that we had with Pakistan, they resigned from State Department the first year that President Trump came. So we are going to be a lot more isolated. If our president is Biden in the next 4 years, I don't claim that he's going to have an easy task bringing India, Pakistan, and giving Kashmiris the right to vote, and then also taking care of the Middle East. And I don't think he's going to be able to do that in the first couple of years, because we've got COVID, we've got healthcare, we've got systemic racism, we've got a divided, severely polarized nation. And when he is able to heal, that is when he can look beyond America and start talking about, like he said, Kashmir, and also make amends and go out there and undo some of the damage that President Trump and indeed sometimes the Obama administration had done. I had written very fiercely against the drone attacks because I was on President Obama's campaign, and I'd said that that is not okay. But the change comes slowly. The change has to be gradual. If it comes overnight, it might not stay. So I think there's a lot of hope in Biden's foreign policy. They are going to be different Democrats. Democrats are going to be younger. A lot of the Republicans that were in favor of Pakistan, they are not there anymore. So, the whole thing, like Republicans, they know Pakistan. These Republicans don't know Pakistan. So we have to understand that as Pakistanis, we have to understand how the game has changed, the demographics have changed. I still have friends in the Republican Party who understand Pakistan. I've had open conversations with them. And as a Pakistani, I'm going to meet both of them. I'm going to walk the middle ground. And that's what we all need to do as thinking Americans.
Right, Anila. Dr. Amna, in 2 terms of President Obama, the Democrat president, he never visited Pakistan. There was an unprecedented drone strikes in Afghanistan and Pakistan. That was probably the situation that was going on at that time in the region. And the wars that I just talked about from Syria to Afghanistan, they were going on at that time. Trump's foreign policy, at least many people think that he has been trying to pull out troops, as I just mentioned earlier, from these countries. And it's less about now wars in Middle East and Afghanistan and South Asia, and it's more about their focus on China. How do you see these two trends in the Democrats and the Republicans, and what is the view from Pakistani perspective on this?
Yeah, I think that this is the traditional, this is against the traditional stands of both political parties in the United States. A Republican normally stood for wars, and they were, so since they were sponsored by military industrial complex.
Republicans or Democrats?
Republicans.
Okay.
They were sponsored by military industrial complex, and so they always started war, like President Bush he went
Right,
for.
okay.
And the Democrat came with a certain economic agenda and started rehabilitation of economy, attracted people and especially the domestic voters, because at the end domestic voters matters.
Right.
And you see, but in this century we have seen the trend, as you just mentioned, Mr. Obama started wars and he extended, but I think that he did not start actually, it was the running wars he extended. Inherited wars, and he could not pull out at the pace he wanted to. He announced withdrawal in 2014 and he could not manage because of the extended commitments in the region, and in Middle East it was not possible for him because.
Or was it mainly about political will? Probably
Yeah,
Democrats
exactly.
lacked political will.
It was also the matter of political will. Secondly, it was obsession with the pro-Israeli policy, and most of the policy, as you see, that Mr. Trump is following in Middle East, that is proactive policy in favor of Israel. All these commitments which he is winding out, I think that is a consistent pattern we see, that first they haunted all Middle Eastern countries with war, violence, and they supported the governments which were against the people's will.
But this is interesting. You mentioned that Republicans were more focused on, let's say, starting wars.
Traditionally.
But Trump is now pulling out troops and
exactly.
focusing on economy. So he's doing the other.
I am
things
saying
otherwise?
the same, that in this century, in 21st century,
Right.
we are actually witnessing the totally different
Change
trends.
of trend.
That Mr. Trump is pulling back and he is asking to pull back. But I see the American policy in a consistency. The consistency in the form of first occupying or subduing the already their governments which were dictators and not people's representative, when they were obsessed with war and they were threatened and their economies are now declining. Now they are offering them deals, peace deals, having good relations with Israel. You will be having no threat, and you see that UAE is the first victim, and then it is expected that KSA would sign.
This is interesting. Many people think that probably US is outsourcing Middle East to Israel. So that is another way of looking at it.
Yeah, exactly. And we have been discussing this fact sitting with in Prime Minister's National Security Advisor think tank, that it is actually a bluff. And you know, as far as foreign policy is concerned, Americans make their foreign policy and for 20 years, and then they close their ears and brain, and then they do whatever they have chalked out, and that is it is the matter of implementation. Every president has to do under the policy which is carved under National Security Advisory Cell and Pentagon. That is a blend of two, and Americans are following this policy, and any president coming in office would not be able to wind it up. Anti-Iran policy, that would continue, and that is
yes.
cooperation within line is also continued. Cooperation where they are having conformity of interest, like you see in Syria they were having cooperation, but elsewhere they were not having.
So these 2 points are very important, Afghanistan and Iran. Salman, these are the two countries that every US president has been focused on. US has been focused on primarily. Iran, the number one, probably Republicans are America's number one enemy at the moment. That's what they think about Iran. Afghanistan, an unending war that has been going on for the last 19 years in Afghanistan. They want to wind it up, but let's see what happens. President Trump's approach towards Pakistan, I remember his tweets at the start of 2018, not very pleasant. And they were also, given a counter narrative from the Pakistani side. But since the intra-Afghan talks started, things started getting better between Pakistan and United States. How do you see the future of Pakistan and US, Trump or Biden, whoever?
I don't see a Kerry-Lugar pact coming through because that was a function of an earlier age when the US needed us more, when we were badly hyphenated with Afghanistan. We're not hyphenated anymore. And I think the one issue that really does stand to get affected by the outcome of the election is Afghanistan and how that goes. There's a lot of anticipation among warring groups there, etc., even the government, particularly about the nature of aid that Afghanistan receives going forward. Now, Mr. Biden has made it very clear on the presidential campaign that he is simply not interested in investing more. Also, let's bear in mind that this election is coming at the tail end of a rather long war, which is now being called the forever war. Both presidents, whoever goes forward, will want to pull out. There is a lot of fatigue within the US, and there is also an expansion of programs, of military programs going forward. I think foreign policy, whoever goes forward will, and that includes the question of Pakistan, will see a kind of automatic control. Too much has happened over the last 4 years for either presidential candidate not to take notice. I don't think there is enough more room for adventure here. There is a lot of fatigue that every constituency across the US has messaged and has made a case out of. Any president going forward will not want an extension of US resources or military in any conflict theater. There may be an engagement via proxy, but coming back to the question of Pakistan, I think under the democratic presidencies we have had a more measured, engaged, less transactional dynamic, where there are investments in outside the executive branch into we've had leads in Congress as well. Our trade bodies have exchanged groups, etc. There is a more wholesome sense of democracy programming, aid programming, things like agriculture, the whole USAID kind of imprint in Pakistan. That has been expanded under the democratic presidencies. Not so much under Mr. Trump, who again has a very transactional, very deal-cutting ethic, and the sort of benefits or the asks from Pakistan are very few, and they pertain to Afghanistan. Can we create stability there? And yes, we played a role while the Trump-Taliban talks were going on. We did what we could and got some relief there. Going forward also, I don't think any presidency that comes now into the White House will turn its eyes away from India. India has much more to offer. It has been putting that merchandise on the table for a long time, and with Ms. Harris in office, should that happen, I think
much more to offer in terms of, let's say, containing China primarily,
not just on the foreign policy sense, but a very robust trade relationship. India is becoming the largest sort of purchaser of arms in South Asia, of US merchandise, and that's
but during the Trump time, I think
that relationship has expanded very much so. With Mr. Biden, I think that will expand manyfold.
But the strategic relationship probably has strengthened. But in terms of economy, probably US has been drifting a little away from it.
That is a function of the US's own position and its own dynamic. I mean, there was a problem with oil supplies. There was a pandemic that disrupted supply chains, etc. That turned every country slightly isolationist during this period. Now, the US has, talking about the international economy, the US has been talking about self-sufficiency in oil for a long time.
Right.
And that does create a certain mercantile thinking on the part of, produce in America. That slogan we've also been hearing from India, make in India sort of thing. But the trade relationship will not be wished away. These ties will strengthen, and this does undercut Pakistan's relationship to some degree, which finds itself more and more integrated in the Chinese camp. Trade or foreign policy or security wise, Pakistan is looking at China as its mainstay, and that is problematic.
Anita, this foreign policy issue, how do you see Pakistan-US relations in the future? Let's say Trump or Biden, whoever in the White House. What is the future of Pakistan-US relations?
You know, with President Trump, I don't see much of a change. I think things are going to be the same, very much the same. It is going to be an isolationist policy, less intervention abroad, less intervention in Pakistan. He, during the elections, just a couple of days ago, sent Secretary Pompeo to India to sign trade deals and spread goodwill. So you can see where he's leaning. Whereas a Biden presidency has more chances of developing good relationships with Pakistan. Pakistan should also think about its self-interest. Somebody mentioned the UAE is a victim. I don't think that UAE is a victim. I don't think that anybody is a victim over there. We've always said, well, you know what, let the Arabs come forward, let them also take part in resolving the Middle East conflict. So let them do that. Let Israel and Israelis and the Arabs work it out. Let's talk about Kashmir. And it's this stand that we've taken when we talk to our representatives, that we have been able to bring the issue of Kashmir as an emerging issue. And that is why you heard Joe Biden talk about Kashmir, because we said, okay, here's the Abraham Accord, it's happening over there, let's talk about Kashmir. So I see it as it's going to be definitely, he's going to need bipartisan support to do anything to bring the two countries at the table to resolve Kashmir. Human rights, definitely, you're going to hear a lot more. Look, Representative Ro Khanna, he's a Hindu, he's an Indian, and he spoke up for, against Modi for the Muslims. And he got targeted by...
Kamala Harris would focus on Kashmir if we see Biden as president and future president of the United States. Biden and Kamala Harris as the vice president would focus on Kashmir, because the perception generally is that Kamala Harris is backed by the Indian lobby, and we also know her inclinations towards India and the Indian foreign policy. So on Kashmir specifically, how do you think that the Biden presidency would talk about Kashmir with India and Pakistan?
Look, for 4 years now, Kamala has been in Senate for 4 years. She hasn't been a part of the Foreign Relations Committee or anything. And she has largely stayed out of foreign policy. Her expertise is law. And I personally think she's going to be focusing on reforming the prison system, working on law enforcement, etc., etc. But I think that the Indian lobby has, yes, been with Kamala. So has the Pakistani lobby. I've been with her. I've been working with her for 4 years she's she's been a California senator. And let's not forget that the role of the vice president is quite minimal. And I don't think that she's going to be sitting there and writing foreign policy. She may be an influencer for change. I see her as, we have hope pinned on her that she's going to be South Asian, and she is going to talk about human rights that we hold so dear. We're Democrats, and for us, human rights are important. But to shift the conversation to Kashmir, it has taken us 20 years to do that. Democrats, I'm still educating my Democratic friends on a Kashmir issue. And a large part of them are Jews. They didn't know about the conflict, and now they are being educated. So it's also up to the Pakistanis to come forward and start talking about things that matter to us as Pakistani Americans.
Right. Anila, just a minute. Salman, you have a point?
Yeah, I just have a brief intervention. I think there has been an incident really where Kamala Harris took a very strident position on Kashmir. This displeased many in India. There's been a lot of negative commentary about her, and in fact led to Mr. Jaishankar on one of his trips to refuse to meet with Kamala Harris. Now, shall we make a lot of it, as Indian papers have? Perhaps not. We do know that the Democrats come with a heavy human rights agenda, even if it's does not have any enforcement value on ground, because Mr. Modi will do exactly as he does. Just as the expectation from Kamala Harris on Kashmir is greater. The Indians have also brought about historic changes which are not going to be reversed, with polite noises or suggestions which are a mere talking point in the larger economic and trade and foreign policy partnership that the US and India enjoy.
So Anila, coming to your point, the human rights point, I think would be the most important point when it comes to the Democrats. And do you think that this time, if let's say we expect some Democrat president coming in, Biden presidency would focus on human rights, specifically when it comes to Kashmir? Is that what you are saying?
That is what I'm saying. I'm saying that I have a lot of hope in the young. The House is still, it belongs to the Democrats, and there are people who are younger Democrats who understand the conflict a lot better than the ones that we had previously. And so I have a lot of hope. It's also very diverse. You've got two Muslims who should be speaking up for the Kashmiris. You've got actually three. You've got Andre Carson as well. And
Right.
we should be asking them to speak for human rights in Kashmir, which we are doing. And I think there is a lot more hope. But then I could be wrong as well. But I'm optimistic.
Right, great. Thank you for joining us, Anila. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Dr. Amna. A pleasure having you on the show. Thank you, Salman. Thank you for joining us. That's all from this transmission. Thank you for joining us. Khuda Hafiz.